Hi, and Scott Heron here. This is video number 12 for our CVI Sukur workshop. And in this one, we're introducing the concepts around community vulnerability. So before we do that, we want to look back. The CVI process so far has defined the key values for the Sukur property. It has determined which climate stresses have the greatest impact to those World Heritage values. And we've learned about assessing the exposure, the sensitivity, and we're going to soon reach into the adaptive capacity relating to the key climate stresses. So 2 of those we've undertaken earlier today. The 3rd will be our first step tomorrow. So that will culminate our first section of the CVI framework and give us the assessment of OUV vulnerability. This presentation is looking at the second phase, which is the second part. They're looking at the community vulnerability. And that's what we'll be describing in this video. Our analysis for community vulnerability is built around assessments of economic, social, and cultural connections. The first of these, economic, considers business types that are directly associated with the World Heritage property. The second element is the social component, which looks at interactions with the property. We're going to consider the local population, other domestic visitors, and international visitors. This is an important emphasis here. To have a social interaction, you have to have had a physical presence on the property. You must have visited. So at this point in time, as an example, I do not have a social connection with the Sukur Cultural Landscape. I have not been there. The third element is a cultural connection. Now, you can have a cultural connection even if you haven't visited a property, because it links in some way to your identity. It links into your cultural persona. Now, this might be Indigenous culture. It can also be non-Indigenous culture, but it is a connection with the property. It links in with the notion of identity. I'd like to illustrate this in a certain way, and if you can bear with me for a moment. When I was a very young child, when I was still a baby, I was taken to a cultural World Heritage location. Well, it is now a cultural World Heritage location in Australia. Uluru, Ayers Rock, right in the middle of Australia. That's the only time that I have been to that location. So I do not consider myself to have a social interaction, a social connection with Uluru. However, because it is a part of Australiana, it is a part of being Australian, I do have a sense within me, a cultural connection to that particular location. It's unique. It's a part of Australia, and that's my connection. There are many Indigenous reasons for connections to Uluru for the local Indigenous traditional owners. But for me, it's not an Indigenous connection. It's my non-Indigenous Australian connection. I hope that that's helped you to understand the distinction between social and cultural. I'll try one more just in case. My grandfather was from Scotland, but I had never been to Scotland until just over 2 years ago, with the exception of a time when I was a very small child. There's a theme here, isn't there? So whilst I had a cultural connection to Scotland, even growing up, I mean, for goodness sake, my name is Scott. I'm named after the country. But I did not have a social interaction until 2 years ago, when as an adult, I visited and experienced parts of that Scottish entity that is my heritage. It is my cultural identity, but now is also a part of my social connection. I hope those examples have been helpful. One of the key things that we always do, we've learned to do through the process of CVI applications, is to look to a scenario to help us consider economic, social, and cultural connections. And so here we look at the ideas of what the future climate might look like, what changes will occur towards our time frame, which for us is 2050, to help link across to ideas around the economic, social, and cultural connections. As an example, for Shark Bay, Western Australia, the three key climate stresses are listed there on the left-hand side: extreme temperature events, storm intensity and frequency, and air temperature increase. Within that workshop, we built a scenario to help understand what impacts might carry across to the community components from those changes to climate. So for that, the scenario was that extreme temperature events around the 2050 era would occur 5 times per decade. That the storm intensity and frequency component, the stressor, would experience a doubling of the frequency of severe storms. And thirdly, that the air temperature would increase by 1 degree Celsius. By considering those aspects, it helped us to think forwards to what the changes would be on the economy, on society, and to culture. Another example here for the very north of Scotland, in the heart of Neolithic Orkney. In this, whilst we'd identified the 3 key stresses, now shown on the right-hand side in brackets, sea level rise, storm intensity and frequency, and precipitation trend, the focus of the scenario was on impacts to elements of the property. So coastal impacts at the coastal location, Skara Brae, an increase in the groundwater table, and a burial tomb, Maeshow, as a part of the property, and the accessibility of the walking path around the ring of Brodgar being no longer available. And so they were some of those scenario pointers that helped us to consider what the economic, social, and cultural impacts would be. A third example for the Wadden Sea in Northern Europe. Here we lent again into the climate projection information to say sea level rise was projected to increase by 32 centimeters. The temperature of the ocean would increase by nearly 1 degree Celsius, and that extreme temperature events would see a 2 to 10-fold increase in their frequency. By considering these scenarios, we were able to map forwards the potential impacts on the community. Let's step for a moment into the economic connections. First, we want to consider business types that are associated with the World Heritage property. And these might include tourism activities or different events. They might include goods and services provided by the property. They might include the government institutions or education and research undertaken at the property. And there may be aspects of conservation activities that would be incorporated as parts of the economic process, the economic connections of the property. For the selected business types, and these are examples, generic examples across World Heritage properties. For the specific selected business types, we then look to compile representative information that might be estimates of economic value or the number of people engaged in different activities. And we look to assess the level of reliance of those business types upon the World Heritage values. and therefore how the businesses might be affected if there is a loss of those World Heritage values with climate change. For society, we look at these social connections and we consider three different people groups, as mentioned before. The locals, the residents, or those who live nearby, other domestic visitors, and international visitors. And we consider the potential impacts that a loss of World Heritage values due to climate change may have on the people who use or visit the property. Interaction is a key word. The third pillar for the community vulnerability is the cultural connection. Here we look at all of the different possible cultural connections, again looking at these people groupings, locals, domestic people, and international people. Now, this assessment is about identity. It doesn't require, as mentioned before, a specific visit to the property. We then combine these three factors, the economic, social, and cultural assessments, to lead us to our final assessment for the ESC dependency and the ESC adaptive capacity. The dependency term looks to the future. It looks and considers the future effect on the economy, society, and culture of the loss of World Heritage values due to the key climate stresses. With respect to adaptive capacity, the scoring, the assessments look to the current level of capacity, the capacity now to adapt in the face of the loss of those World Heritage values due to the key climate stresses. It's important to have that focus on the dependency looking to the future effects and the adaptive capacity only reliant upon what's available now. And it's an important notion there as we go through the process. Well, that's the summary of the economic, social, and cultural aspects that we'll be considering. The next set of videos will look to individual aspects of economic, and then social, and then cultural. The first of those, economic, is the next video for this afternoon.